Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at Denver and Rio Grande Western steam locomotive number 346. This 1881 vintage coal burner is today the oldest steam locomotive operating in Colorado. The 140-year-old icon is proudly displayed at the museum and occasionally steamed up for service to pull trains and pose for photographers. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject steam locomotive entered service at a critical time in the expansion of the narrow-gauge Denver and Rio Grande system, and was one of the railroad's largest freight locomotives for over 2 decades. Come join me now as we take a look at the history of this Colorado favorite and how it survived through adversity and managed to return to operation shortly after the museum first opened here in Golden. The Denver and Rio Grande is best known for having pioneered 3-foot narrow gauge for its railroad network in the Rocky Mountain region. The brainchild of General William J. Palmer, a decorated U.S. Army officer from the Civil War, the railroad built south from Denver towards Colorado Springs and Pueblo beginning in 1871. The Rio Grande inaugurated service using small steam locomotives with diminutive 4-wheeled tenders. Early on, it also tried a larger, British-built double-ended articulated locomotive, but that didn't catch on. By 1876, the size of the line's locomotives was growing, and standard 8-wheel tenders were the norm. Beginning the very next year, in 1877, the Rio Grande's locomotive fleet would begin to change more drastically. A new type of locomotive was joining the team. The first consolidation ever rolled out of Baldwin's Philadelphia Locomotive Works in 1866, responding to the growing demand being placed on railroads following the Civil War. After 1875, in fact, the Consolidation would become the most popular type of freight locomotive in the United States. It was built in greater quantities than any other single steam locomotive wheel arrangement. In Colorado, the Denver and Rio Grande was the first railroad to order Consolidations for service. The Consolidation wheel arrangement, as it was named, represented a notable advance in steam power. This type of locomotive featured 2 leading wheels to help guide it around curves and over uneven trackage, followed by 8 driving wheels which carried most of the locomotive's weight to aid in pulling power, and no trailing wheels under the firebox. In recognition of the Denver and Rio Grande's many steep grades and heavy trains, the railroad in 1877 ordered one 56-ton 280 and one 60-ton 280 for testing. Because it was easier on the Rio Grande's lightly built tracks, the smaller 56-ton version was preferred for the next several years. Over 50 more of this type were built between 1878 and 1881. After 1881, the 60-ton 280 locomotive would become popular, and nearly 100 of these would ultimately be built for the Denver and Rio Grande. With the railroad hauling longer and more frequent trains, even larger consolidations were a logical next step. Our subject locomotive, which began life as Denver and Rio Grande number 406 and named Cumbres, was part of an order for 17 new 70-ton consolidations placed with Baldwin and delivered in 1881. Interestingly, a last-minute change requested by the railroad resulted in 5 of these locomotives having their track gauge widened prior to delivery. These would become the railroad's very first standard gauge locomotives, needed because that same year the railroad dual-gauged its rails between Denver and Pueblo. The year 1881 was particularly significant for the Denver and Rio Grande. Never before nor after did it build so much trackage in a single year. A major motivator was the threat of competition from larger companies such as the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, as well as smaller upstarts like the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. Because the railroad was so busy and expanding so quickly, a total of 63 new locomotives would be added to the roster that single year. Of this total, over 50 were consolidations. The railroad's 12 narrow-gauge 70-ton consolidations, designated Class 70 by the railroad, would be joined by another half-dozen similar locomotives in 1877. until the introduction of even larger narrow gauge steam locomotives on the Rio Grande in the first decade of the 20th century. Number 406 and its classmates would be the railroad's heaviest and most powerful 3-foot gauge freight locomotives. In this role, they served as the primary motive power to lift heavy trains over the railroad's steepest grades and highest mountain passes. By the mid-1880s, the Denver and Rio Grande system stretched from Denver to Pueblo, then headed west via 2 main routes. The first of these, which began as the railroad's main route to Salt Lake City, traveled west through the Royal Gorge to Salida, up over Marshall Pass to Gunnison, through the famed Black Canyon of the Gunnison River to Montrose, and north to Grand Junction. From Grand Junction, the route continued into Green River, Utah, then up and over Soldier Summit, and northwest to Salt Lake City. The other primary route was known as the San Juan Extension. It headed south out of Pueblo to Walsenburg, then west over La Veta Pass into the San Luis Valley, and continuing on to Alamosa and Antonito. From Antonito, the line headed west, running along the Colorado-New Mexico border to Chama and Durango, then north to Silverton. Locomotive number 406, Cumbres, began service in 1881, assigned to both road and helper service on the Rio Grande's primary narrow gauge route over Marshall Pass. For the first 20-plus years of its life, number 406 was equipped with a diamond-style smokestack, early Westinghouse straight air brakes, and the commonly used but later outlawed link and pin couplers, which were responsible for so many trainman injuries, dismemberments, and deaths. Marshall Pass itself boasted not only a 4% grade, but also a twisting route that doubled back on itself numerous times to gain elevation. Snow sheds were built at the summit of the pass at an elevation of 10,842 feet to keep tracks clear in winter. With the snow sheds, helper locomotives could be uncoupled and turned to the summit year-round and head back downgrade to Salida or Gunnison. There, they would be attached to the next train to help push or pull it uphill over the exact same route. Number 406 and its classmates performed similar duties heading eastbound out of Cimarron. The scenery was quite different, with trains climbing a short but sustained 4% grade over a treeless ridge. After they reached the top of the grade, the helpers would again cut off and return to Cimarron. The train would continue eastbound, heading downgrade along Cimarron Creek into the Gunnison and following the Gunnison upriver to its namesake town. In 1903, the Class 70 consolidations, including number 406, found themselves caught up in a new game. Brand new narrow gauge locomotives with a 282 wheel arrangement had just arrived on the Rio Grande, nicknamed mud hens because of their wide, squat appearance. Notwithstanding their looks, these new locomotives were much heavier and more powerful than the Class 70 engines. Thus, they took over the helper duties on Marshall Pass. Like Domino's, the Class 70 locomotives, including number 406, were bumped to other assignments. There would be at least 3 more rounds of newer and more powerful locomotives continuing through the 1920s. With each round, the oldest and smallest steamers would be sold or sent off for scrap, and the remaining locomotives would be relegated to less important and easier jobs. Locomotive number 406 found itself in Durango after this first round of Domino's. A spur track serving the Durango smelter included steep grades, and a more powerful engine was needed. The 1881 veteran remained the yard switcher in Durango for at least a year, and during that time, Janey automatic couplers were installed and the brake system was changed from the older Westinghouse straight air system to automatic air, which helped protect against breakaways on grades. Mandated U.S. railroad safety regulations were responsible for the changes. By 1905, the locomotive was back in helper service, this time on its namesake Cumbres Pass on the Rio Grande's San Juan extension. Smaller Class 60 consolidations typically handled road freights between Alamosa and Durango at the time. The heavier Class 70 locomotives, like number 406, were used to provide additional power as needed between Chama and Antonito, especially on the 4% grades heading eastbound to the summit of the pass at just over 10,000 feet. Just 3 years later, Number 406 was back in service on the Salida to Montrose main line via Marshall Pass. This time, however, it was a road service locomotive and thus had to suffer the indignity of being helped up over Marshall Pass by younger and more powerful helper engines. That same year of 1908, the 1881 veteran would see its first instance of being leased to the Rio Grande Southern. For the next 4 decades, the locomotive would see sporadic service on this scenic route through the San Juan Mountains. Changes in safety regulations again entered the picture when the U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission enacted a much stricter boiler code. Number 406 had been built with a wrought iron boiler, and these became illegal under the new regulations. Major work was undertaken by the Rio Grande's Alamosa shops in 1914 with a carbon steel boiler replacing the original and enhanced with a slightly longer smoke box, along with a new smokestack of the straight shotgun type. A change in Colorado law mandated yet another change. The oil headlight was replaced with an electric model, necessitating the addition of a generator to supply power. One other minor but noteworthy change was made around this same time. The standard Rio Grande rectangular number plate found on the locomotive after 1903 was replaced with a unique round number plate rimmed in brass with raised figures. This same special number plate remains on the locomotive today, although the raised numbers were chiseled off during a later renumbering and replaced with painted numbers. After the overhaul was complete, number 406 went back to work in freight service all across the Rio Grande narrow gauge system. It spent quite a bit of time leased to the Rio Grande Southern as well. A 1921 corporate reorganization led to a name change, and the locomotive was now relettered for the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Then in 1923, the next round of locomotive dominoes fell when the Rio Grande purchased 10 new locomotives of the 282 reel arrangement, otherwise known as Class K28 Mikados. These newest locomotives were even larger and more powerful than their Mudhen predecessors, so they bumped the Mudhens from the Marshall Pass and took over those frontline duties as helper engines. The Mudhens in turn took over operations on the Alamosa to Durango main line, and suddenly the Class 70 locomotives found themselves relegated to a much smaller world. In 1924, just 3 years after its corporate renaming, the Denver and Rio Grande Western undertook a program of renumbering and reclassifying all its locomotives. One day in July, around its 43rd birthday, number 406 entered the Rio Grande Southern Roundhouse in Ridgeway. The locomotive emerged the very next day as Class C19, number 346. The C stood for Consolidation, and the 19 for 19,000 pounds of tractive effort. Weight would no longer define this aging powerhouse, as had been the case with its previous Class 70 designation. Following its reclassification and renumbering, locomotive number 346 continued to pull trains on the Gunnison Division. It also continued to work regularly for the Rio Grande Southern under lease. In 1925, for instance, all of the remaining C-19s were used to help support the fall stock rush, bringing livestock down from the high country of the San Juan Mountains, which the Rio Grande Southern traversed. They joined 2 identical locomotives that had been sold by the Denver and Rio Grande to the Rio Grande Southern almost a decade earlier. Also in 1925, the Denver and Rio Grande Western purchased more new narrow-gauge 282 steam locomotives. Once again, these Class K36 machines were bigger and more powerful than those that came before them, and in fact, nearly twice as powerful as number 346 and its classmates. In 1928, the railroad added its final batch of narrow-gauge steam locomotives, the massive K37 class. The locomotive dominoes continued to fall, with older and smaller locomotives being sold off, mostly for scrap, all through the 1920s and into the 1930s. Although the Rio Grande Southern was regularly leasing locomotives from the larger Denver and Rio Grande Western, the reality was that its own financial situation was perilous. By 1929, it was so bad that the Southern decided it would no longer lease locomotives to cut expenses. As the Depression deepened, number 346 experienced something new and unsettling. It was placed in storage during the times it wasn't needed. Luckily, In early 1936, number 346 found itself, along with two of its classmates, leased to yet another Colorado narrow gauge railroad, the Colorado and Southern. That railroad had already applied for abandonment, but it suddenly was experiencing a traffic surge caused by a short-term need for 2 million tons of building materials from its major online customer, the molybdenum mine at Climax. The three leased Rio Grande locomotives were transported to the railroad's 7th Street Roundhouse in Denver on a flat car. They were given new bear trap-style cinder-catching smokestacks for the assignment, but otherwise nothing was outwardly changed. All three helped pull Colorado and Southern trains from Denver up the South Platte River Canyon, up over Kenosha Pass, into South Park, and from Como to Climax and Leadville via Boreas Pass and Breckenridge, with grades of up to 4%. In late July 1936, number 346 had just been cut off an eastbound freight running from Como to the summit of Kenosha Pass. The locomotive was heading downhill for Denver light or by itself when tragedy struck. The engineer lost control, and number 346 quickly accelerated down the 4% grade, overturning on a curve and landing on its side in a meadow. The fireman jumped and had only minor injuries, but the engineer was trapped and badly scalded in the cab. He died the next day. Number 346 had luckily landed in soft ground, so although the damage looked terrible, much of it was superficial. After it was uprighted and taken back to Denver, it received a new smokestack, headlight, air pumps, running board, and pilot beam. A steel cab replaced the former wooden one. Most notably, the locomotive ended up with a new, mismatched steam dome cover and sandbox. The decorative, brass-trimmed ones from 1881 had been smashed. Rebuilt, it returned to service on the South Park line, but abandonment was soon approved. Number 346 would have the dubious honor of pulling the final revenue stock train from Denver to Jefferson in April 1937. Back on the Rio Grande narrow gauge system, number 346 served a short stint in and around Gunnison. But that service was short-lived, and in early 1938 it was placed in storage at the Gunnison Roundhouse. There it stayed until early 1941, when World War II traffic increases sent the locomotive to Durango for switching, reprising an earlier assignment. The locomotive occasionally did helper duties on trains to Silverton, and it also saw a fair amount of service once again on the Rio Grande Southern, which was experiencing its own traffic boom during World War II. Given a mechanical overhaul at the Rio Grande's Alamosa shops in 1945, number 346 was leased to the Rio Grande Southern in 1946 and early 1947. But when that service ended, the 1881 veteran was shoved off onto a Durango storage track, awaiting scrapping. Fate came to the rescue once again. The Montezuma Lumber Company, which was operating the last lumber railroad in Colorado at the time, needed a locomotive. Number 346 was pulled out of storage, steamed up, and sent west on the Rio Grande Southern to Dolores. There, the lumber company's track stretched about 5 miles to the company's sawmill town of McPhee, boasting several hundred residents and Colorado's largest lumber mill at the time. Number 346 was given the tender from the locomotive it was replacing so as to avoid the need for relettering. The lumber company was very pleased with the new locomotive and purchased it outright from the Denver and Rio Grande Western. In this new service, not only did it pull gondola loads of railroad ties and boxcars of finished lumber to the Dolores connection, but number 346 also pulled the Saturday night one-car passenger train consisting of a pristine ex-Denver and Rio Grande Western coach to take employees and their families into Dolores for shopping and the weekly movie. It all seemed too good to be true. Unfortunately, a January 1948 fire wiped out the sawmill for the final time, putting an end to the lumber operation forever. Number 346 was used to help tear up the short railroad line. Then it sat in storage, now owned by a Durango junk dealer. The future looked bleak for this pioneering locomotive, despite its interesting history and many travels. Colorado Railroad Museum founder Bob Richardson moved from Ohio to Alamosa around the time the Rio Grande was starting wholesale abandonment of its narrow gauge system. Dismayed at the history that was being lost, he began collecting physical artifacts on his property in Alamosa. Aware of number 346, Bob contacted the Durango junk dealer in 1950 and soon was the proud owner of a rusty locomotive sitting in the weeds in Dolores, Colorado. Richardson hired a boilermaker to inspect his locomotive, and it was pronounced in good mechanical condition despite outward appearances. Now the challenge was to get it to Alamosa. There were a number of obstacles, chief among them the Rio Grande's insistence that no published freight rate existed for hauling a dead locomotive, so it could not even accept number 346 for shipment. Luckily, Richardson had friends in the business, and soon enough a solution was at hand. After more challenges with the railroad, the little locomotive was finally ready for its journey. Rio Grande Southern Locomotive number 20, also preserved and operational today at the Colorado Railroad Museum, was assigned to pick up the locomotive in Dolores and bring it back to Durango, along with a car of scrap, 2 refrigerator cars, and Rio Grande Southern caboose number 0404, also today preserved at the museum. The little locomotive made it to Durango after a dicey trip filled with suspense. There, the Rio Grande picked up number 346, and 2 days later, it was in Alamosa. Richardson left it sitting in the rail yard for a couple of months while he built the necessary track at his narrow gauge motel, further annoying the Rio Grande's management. By the end of November, after a short trip via tractor-trailer, the locomotive had finally arrived at its new home. Bob quickly painted out the Rio Grande lettering, replacing it with his own Mount Blanca and Western, and the appropriate brass dome rings he had somehow salvaged from classmate number 345, which was itself destroyed in summer 1951 in a head-on collision staged for filming of the movie Denver and Rio Grande. Number 346 was joined by other locomotives and additional railroad artifacts in Alamosa, but space was limited at the motel. Luckily, Richardson met Cornelius Houck, another devotee of preserving Colorado narrow gauge history, and plans were soon underway for a move to a new location in Golden, Colorado. In early 1958, the moving began. Although trucks had initially been planned for moving everything, low bridge clearances and a weak bridge on the available highway routes mandated that 3 locomotives, including number 346, be shipped by rail. They were loaded onto standard gauge flat cars and hauled to Denver via La Veta Pass. In Denver, the cars were transferred to the Colorado and Southern for delivery to their destination. Loaded onto lowboy trucks for the final portion of the move, the locomotives arrived at the new museum site in July 1958. Placed on a short stretch of temporary track, number 346 was relettered once again for the fictional Golden City and San Juan Railroad. In July 1962, the 1881 coal burner was fired up for the first time in 14 years. The locomotive was 83 years old at the time. From this point forward, the locomotive would operate until 1977, running up and back on the museum's crescent-shaped operating trackage. Overhauled in 1978-1979 with patches installed to mitigate severe pitting in the lower courses of its boiler, number 346 returned to service on July 4, 1979, as the locomotive celebrated its 98th birthday. Just 2 years later, in 1981, number 346 celebrated its 100th birthday at the museum. In the years following, it pulled many specials, including annual Santa trains. In 1999, the locomotive was there as the Colorado Railroad Museum celebrated a major milestone, the completion of its operating loop. Just 2 years later, as the museum's new roundhouse complex was being completed, number 346 was withdrawn from service because of mechanical concerns. In 2003, the locomotive was shipped to the Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania for boiler patches, new flues and tube sheets, and repairs to axles, hubs, and driving boxes. Returned to Golden in the fall of 2004, number 346 was reassembled and first run in 2007, sporting Denver and Rio Grande Western Class C18 number 318's tender, which it had used since the early 1970s. Number 346's own tender was thoroughly refurbished by the Strasburg Railroad in 2007, and eventually it would once again be paired up with its longtime locomotive mate. In 2011, Consolidation number 346 celebrated its 130th birthday by steaming around the museum's trackage. In the years since, it has been joined in regular operation by one of the locomotives that it played dominoes with nearly a century ago, Rio Grande Class K37 locomotive number 491. And in 2020, Rio Grande Southern number 20, the locomotive that had hauled number 346 out of Dolores and turned it over to the Denver and Rio Grande Western all those years ago, also joined it as an operating steam locomotive at the museum. As number 346 prepares to celebrate its 140th birthday in 2021, a major overhaul is coming into focus. After all, it's been close to 15 years since the locomotive last saw major mechanical work. For now, however, the Colorado Railroad Museum is celebrating another milestone. As of 2021, the museum is proud to host a record number of operational steam locomotives. 3! Never before, in its 60-plus years of history, has this been the case. Thanks for joining me today. Denver and Rio Grande Western steam locomotive number 346 is truly a Colorado icon, and it holds special status as Colorado's oldest operating steam locomotive. But there's more to the story than age alone. This 1881 vintage coal-burning steam locomotive has enjoyed a fascinating and charmed life during its 140-year history. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about number 346 today, and I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.